Have you ever noticed there's an entire generation that everyone seems to forget exists? Born between 1965 and 1980, they're sandwiched between boomers who won't retire and millennials who won't shut up. They're called Gen X, and their psychology is probably the most misunderstood of any generation. So, what actually makes them tick? Let's start at the beginning. Gen X was raised by parents who often weren't there. They were the original latchkey kids, coming home to empty houses and pretty much raising themselves. Both parents were working, divorce rates were skyrocketing, and there was zero supervision. No participation trophies, no helicopter parenting, just a house key on a string around their neck, and maybe a note on the fridge. This childhood created a very specific psychology. Radical self-reliance. Gen X doesn't ask for help because they learned early on that help probably isn't coming. They just figure things out themselves. They don't complain because who's listening? And they don't really share their feelings because feelings weren't a big topic of conversation back then. They just handle it quietly, alone. This is exactly why Gen X is so invisible in today's cultural conversations. Boomers demand attention. Millennials crave validation. Gen Z needs community. But Gen X, they genuinely don't care if you notice them. They were ignored as kids, and they're perfectly fine with being ignored as adults. They've built an entire identity around not needing anyone's acknowledgement. So, let's break down the core psychological traits. The first one is a deep-seated cynicism. Gen X watched their parents' generation promise them prosperity, only to deliver a recession. They were told, work hard and you'll succeed, then graduated into one of the worst job markets in decades. They were sold the American dream and got downsizing, outsourcing, and corporate betrayal instead. So naturally, they stopped believing in institutions. They don't trust big corporations, governments, or any system that promises to take care of them. They saw their parents get laid off after 30 years of loyalty. They're not making that same mistake. This is why Gen X basically invented the side hustle before it was even a term. They knew the company wouldn't be loyal, so why should they be? To younger generations, this might look like negativity, but to Gen X, it's just pattern recognition. They aren't pessimistic. They're realistic, based on their own lived experience. They've seen enough broken promises to stop believing in them. They plan for the worst because, in their experience, the worst often happens. The second trait is extreme independence. Gen X does not do group projects. They don't ask for permission, and they don't wait for a consensus. They learned as kids that if they wanted something done, they had to do it themselves. And that's exactly how they operate as adults. This often makes them a terrible fit for modern corporate culture, which values collaboration and team-bonding exercises. Gen X shows up, does the work exceptionally well, and then goes home. They don't want to grab drinks after work. They don't care about the company culture. They're there for a paycheck, not to find a new family. And they're genuinely confused why millennials and Gen Z are so invested in their workplace relationships. To Gen X, work is work. It's not your identity, and it's not your community. It is a transaction. You trade your time and skills for money. That's Italiano. The whole idea of finding your life's purpose in a job seems insane to them, especially after watching their parents dedicate their lives to companies that eventually discarded them. The third defining trait is emotional guardedness. Gen X does not overshare. They're not posting their every feeling on social media. They don't go to therapy and then broadcast every single breakthrough to the world. They process things internally and move on. To them, emotions are private. Problems are private. Struggles are private. Now, this isn't repression. It's about having boundaries. Gen X grew up in an era where you were expected to deal with your own problems. You didn't broadcast them for public consumption, and you didn't seek external validation for your feelings. You just figured it out and kept moving forward. So, to them, the current culture of constant emotional sharing can feel like a strange form of attack. They look at millennials posting about their mental health journeys and Gen Z making TikToks about their trauma, and they're just ... confused. Why would you tell complete strangers all your business. Why do you need public support for what they see as private problems? In the Gen X psychological playbook, strength is silent. Competence is quiet. You prove yourself through your actions, not through announcements. The fourth trait is a powerful adaptability born from chaos. Gen X grew up during massive technological and cultural shifts. They remember life before the internet and seamlessly adapted to life with it. They learned cursive in school and then learned how to type. They used physical encyclopedias for research and then learned how to use Google. They lived through the entire transition from analog to digital, and they just handled it. This makes them uniquely flexible. They aren't stuck in the old ways like some boomers, but they're not completely dependent on new technology like the younger generations. They can function perfectly in both worlds. They are the only generation that is truly bilingual in both the old systems and the new. This adaptability also extends to their worldview. Gen X doesn't cling to rigid ideologies. They're pragmatic. Whatever works, works. They don't care so much about being right. They care about getting results. This can make them look uncommitted or wishy-washy to other generations that are more ideologically driven, but from a Gen X perspective, everyone else is just being too rigid. The fifth trait is using dark humor as a defense mechanism. Gen X jokes about everything. Death, failure, disaster. Nothing is off limits. This isn't because they're insensitive, but because humor is how they process the world. They learned from a young age that life is often absurd and unfair, so you might as well laugh at it. This is why Gen X basically invented ironic detachment. Taking everything seriously all the time would be completely exhausting. So they mock everything, especially themselves. They were the first generation to really make self-deprecation a core personality trait. They do take themselves too seriously, because they know that taking anything too seriously just sets you up for disappointment. Younger generations might see this as toxic cynicism, but Gen X sees it as a survival skill. If you can laugh at how bad things are, those things can't hurt you as much. Humor creates a safe distance from pain. It's armor disguised as a joke. And the sixth trait is a total rejection of labels. Gen X hates being put in a box. They don't identify strongly with their own generational label. They don't get excited about personality tests. They don't align with tribes. They are allergic to being categorized, because being categorized means being controlled. This comes from growing up in an era that was constantly trying to define them as slackers or disaffected youth. The name Generation X was literally chosen because they refused to be defined. They rejected every single label society tried to stick on them. And they're still doing it today. Ask a Gen Xer what generation they belong to, and they'll probably just shrug. They don't care. Generational identity feels like a marketing gimmick to them. They see themselves as individuals who just happened to be born in the same time period. And that's it. The psychological result of all these traits is a generation that is simultaneously the most self-sufficient and the most isolated. They don't need anyone, which often means they end up with no one. They're so good at handling everything on their own that they've forgotten how to let people in. They've mistaken their independence for invulnerability. And this is the dark side of the Gen X psychology. They're incredibly capable, but often deeply lonely. They have all the skills, but can struggle with intimacy. They can survive absolutely anything, but they don't know how to ask for help when just surviving isn't enough. The world sees Gen X as the forgotten middle child of generations. And honestly, they've leaned into it. They've made invisibility their personal brand. But the problem with being invisible is that nobody notices when you're struggling, and Gen X is struggling. With retirement uncertainty, with aging parents and grown kids, with being sandwiched between generations that need them while being completely ignored by the culture at large. But they won't tell you any of this, because that's not how Gen X works. They'll just make a sarcastic joke, change the subject, and go handle it themselves. Like they always have, Gen X built the modern world, and nobody even noticed. And they're fine with that. Or at least, they say they are. Subscribe if you want more. Psychology of the generations that nobody talks about. If you're Gen X, comment and let me know if I got this right or completely wrong.